We'll get started in about 2 more minutes. All right, it's 6:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. So my name's Dan Steffi, and what we'll do with these Zoom sessions is I will kind of go over some of the material that you should have learned while reading through the content for the week. And then I'll also touch on some things in your assignments that can kind of give you a hint or give you direction about where to go for the assignments. I do record these Zoom sessions, and I put them on YouTube. And so if you miss something, or if you're not able to attend the entire time, then I will send out a link to these videos sometime later this evening. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So this is CMIS 102. It's the basic programming course, and of course we focus on Python in this class. So let's get right into it. So we'll start off with the first topic that you should have learned for this week, and it is variables and types. So in Python, let me move this out of my way. Everybody should be able to see my screen being projected. All right, so in any programming, and Python is no different, you have things called variables, and those variables have a type. What a variable is just say a sequence of letters, and it can be anything you want to name it. Let's just call it ASDF. That's easy to type on my keyboard. And we can say that is equal to something, right? Let's just say it's equal to the number 2, right? We'll put that in. What I'm saying is I have a variable. The variable name is ASDF, and it has the value of 2. Now, what does that mean? That means anywhere else in my program, I can use this variable ASDF, and it'll be the exact same thing as if I was using the number 2. So for example, let's back up one space. Let's print the number 2. And so what happens when we do that? Let's save it. I'll run the file here on my command line. And what does it print? Of course, it prints the number 2, because that's exactly what I told Python to do, is print 2. I can tell it to print a floating point number, a decimal number. Do that, and there it is. It prints this decimal number, right? I can tell it to print a string. This is a string. And strings are denoted by these apostrophes, right? That's the beginning and ending of the string. And if I print out this string, and of course it prints out, this is a string. So whatever I put inside this print is what Python prints out whenever you run the program, right? So let's take that to the concept of a variable. Remember, if I have a variable ASDF and I want it to be the number 3, what I can do is if I print this variable, what do we think is going to get printed out? Well, like I said, this is the variable, and we're saying it is equal to 3. So anywhere else in my program where I use this variable name, it's the same thing as if I put this number 3 there. So if I save and run this, this should print out 3. Let's run it. And sure enough, right there, it prints the 3. I can make it a decimal number. Save it, run it. It prints out that decimal number. I can make this variable a string. QWERTY. If I save it and run it, it'll print out QWERTY, right? So that's what a variable does. A variable just represents whatever value that you assign to it. And that's how we assign to it with the equals mark. We're saying this variable is equal to whatever I put right here. And then anywhere else I use this variable, it's the exact same thing as if I was using this value. So what kind of variables do we have? We can have an integer, whole numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 40, 42, so on and so forth. Those are integers. A variable can be a decimal number, what we call a float. Right? This is saying this variable b is equal to this floating point number. And we can have strings. We can say c is equal to, this is a string, right? And then we can print out each of those. Let's say print a, let's print b, let's print c, and it should print out each of those variables, with a being an integer, b being a float, and c being a string. Let's run it. And there we go. It prints out that integer, that float, and that string, right? So those are our 3 primary types of variables. There are more, but we'll get to those later in the course. But for right now, you really just need to focus on, we have integers, we have floats, and we have strings. And now, how do I know that they're that type? Well, in Python, we have something called type of, right? So instead of printing a, let's say I want to type, I want to print the type of a. What this will do, when I say type of a, it'll tell me what type it is. It'll tell me, is it an integer? Is it a float? Is it a string? And so then I'm saying, I want you to print the type of a. So if we save it and run it, what should be printed here? Well, it should be an integer because a is an integer. Let's run it. Oh, type of not defined. Oh, sometimes I get my programming languages mixed up. Give me 1 second. Maybe it's just type. Yep, sorry, it's just type. Type of is I think it's C#. There we go, type. Now let's save it and run it. And it should tell me that that's an integer, right? And there you go. It says it's an integer, right? Well, let's print out the types of all of them. Print out the type of A, the type of B, and the type of C. So what should get printed here? Well, I'm going to print out the type of A, which is an integer. I'm going to print out the type of B, which is a float. And I'm going to print out the type of C, which is a string. So if I run this, sure enough, it says it's an integer, it's a float, and it's a string. So those are the 3 types of variables that you really need to focus on in Python right now. Okay, so let's talk about, so we have this concept of variables. Let's talk about operators. You know, what are operators? Operators are your normal math type stuff. You know, we have plus for addition, minus for subtraction, the star for multiplication, that the slash for division, a couple of them that aren't as apparent. This means power. And I'll talk, there's two more, but let's cover these first and then I'll get to the other two. So let's first talk about addition, right? So what if we want to print, let's just print 2 plus 3. What should happen here? It should print 5, right? Because Python knows how to use the plus sign. It knows how to add these two numbers together. And then print will just print out what those two numbers added together are. Save it, run it. Sure enough, you know, there it prints a 5. You know, it can be decimal numbers. Save it, print it, and there's the decimal number. So addition works just like you think it would from, you know, years of doing math in school. Same concept applies to subtraction. Let's do this. 2.25 minus 3. Save it and run it. And there it is, minus 0.75, just like we would expect. Nothing surprising there. You know, it has multiplication. Whatever that is multiplied out, you can do it if you want. We'll just print it out. 6.75 is the answer to that math problem. And then, of course, we have the division symbol. Save it and run it. And it's 0.75 is those numbers divided. Right? That's pretty easy stuff. You know, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Like I said, we also have, when you have 2 stars, it means power. So if we take 2 to the power of 4, what is that answer? Was that like 16, right? Yeah, should be 16. 2 raised to the 4th power is 16. So we save that and run it. There you go. It gives you the answer of 16. We say 2 to the power of 32. Save it and run it. That's like 4 billion and something. And sure enough, there's the answer. There's hundreds, thousands, millions. Yes, 4.29 billion, right? 2 raised to the 32nd power. So sometimes, you know, in our everyday math, you know, we're kind of used to seeing this, right? You know, something like that, maybe 2 carat for power. That's not the case. This is something different, which we're not going to cover right now. But for powers, you just got to remember it's 2 stars. Now, there's something special about division. There's actually a couple ways that division can be done. So if we say divide 5 divided by 2, what is the answer to that? Well, in normal everyday math, the answer to that is 2.5, right? Let's save it and run it. And Python says it's 2.5. Okay. What happens if we have 2 slashes? This is what we call integer division. And it's not just a Python thing. It exists in every programming language. It's called integer division. What integer division does is it does the division, but then it throws away the decimal number. So if 5 divided by 2 is 2.5, then 5 with the integer division of 2 should just be 2. Because the normal answer is 2.5, but with integer division, you throw away the decimal part. Let's run it. And sure enough, the answer is 2. You know, same thing if we did 25 divided by 6. I don't know if that's like 4, right? So if we do normal division, Let's show both normal division and then integer division. You'll see the difference. Save it and let's run it. And there you go. Normal division is 4 1/6, as a fraction, but 4.1666, etc. But with integer division, you throw out the decimal and you only keep the whole number. So it's 4. Kind of in the same vein with this division, we have what we call the modulus operator. It's a percent sign. What this will do, it will get the remainder of the division. So if 25 divided by 6 is 4 remainder 1, right? So what this will do, it'll calculate the 1 because the remainder is 1. Let's save it. Let's run it. And there you go. The remainder is 1. So if we add one more there, 26, that should be remainder 2, right? Let's change the rest of these to 26 and see how it affects it. And sure enough, there we go. There's the normal division, there's the integer division, and there is the remainder. So that's what it means when you see the / integer division, and when you see the percent, meaning give me the remainder of this operation. All right. So in all these print statements, I'm doing it with hard-coded numbers, but we can do it with the variables. We can have A is equal to 26. We have B is equal to 6. And then we can run these same calculations. We can have A divided by B. We have A integer division B, and we can have A remainder B. It's going to be the same exact thing because I can use these variables in place of the actual numbers. And it's like the same math as if I just replace the A with what it's equal to, which is 26. I'll run this. You see, I end up getting the same answer. You can also calculate it not inside the print, but we can have a new variable C is equal to A divided by B. Let's get rid of these extra prints now. So we say C is equal to that, and then we can just print out the C in here. Meaning now I have a new variable C, and that C is going to be equal to A divided by B. So if I print this out, it should be the 4.33333. And there it is. C is 4.3333333, etc. So that kind of covers variables and the operators, right? And with variable names can be anything you want. It can be as long as you want. It could be whatever that is. Say that equals 5. Let's print out this long variable name. And that's going to work just fine. It doesn't make a lot of sense to try to remember all those letters, but it works. Save it and run it. And sure enough, it prints out a 5. Because the variable name can be almost anything you want it to be. One thing it can't be, it has to start with a letter. You can't start it with a special character or a number. So if I have one, so let's put 5 and some letters, that's not going to work. It's going to give me an error. If I try to do that, I'll run it, syntax error, invalid syntax, and it's telling me right here there's a problem, on line 1. So there's a problem right here. It's because I started with a letter. I also cannot start with a special character. If I put like a $sign in that, that can't be my variable name. Same thing, it gives me an error. So I have to start with a letter, and it can be uppercase letter or it can be lowercase, either is fine. I can have numbers in it as long as it doesn't start with a number. So this is fine. Quirk 4444, save it and run it. And That works because I can have numbers, but I can't start with a number. Also, Python is case sensitive. What I mean by that is lowercase a is different from uppercase a. So if we print lowercase a and then we print uppercase a, they're different things. Save and run it. It prints out a 5 and it prints out a 6. Why? Because lowercase a is not the same thing as uppercase a. They're two different variables. Now, what I can do is, even though I said a is equal to 5 here, it doesn't have to stay 5 forever. So let's make a 5. We'll print out a, and then we'll say a is 4 plus 3, right? And let's print a again. Save it and run it, and it'll do what you think it should do. Prints out 5 and then prints out 7, which makes sense because a starts out to be 5, and I print a, which is 5. Now I'm changing the value of a and saying a is, this math problem, which is 7, and then I print out a, which is 7. It's the same variable, but I've changed the value of that variable. All right. Let's go on to the next thing about operators. And also, I didn't say at the beginning, as we go through this, if you have a question, feel free to go ahead and chime in with any questions. But I'll also give you some time at the end of the demonstrations where I'll open it up for any kind of question and answer session. But if you just see something as we're going along, let me know. Okay, so let's talk about something else related to operators, and that's operator precedence. You should have learned this way back in probably middle school or something like that. Operator precedence, right? Was it PEMDAS, right? It's parenthesis, then exponent, then multiplication, then division, then addition, then subtraction, right? Right, that's PEMDAS, right? That's like the acronym to remember. So what do I mean by PEMDAS? So let's say we have, let's leave that up there. If you haven't seen yet, the semicolon in Python means it's a comment, meaning this is not code to execute. It's just something in there it's like a reminder in there. It's what we call a comment. All right, so I'm going to leave that in there so we can see it. So let's talk about operator precedence. So if I have a is equal to 5 plus 7, I'm going to print out a. That's easy enough. That's going to be 12, right? Save it and run it. Oh, I'm sorry. It's the hashtag, not a semicolon. Semicolon is something else. All right, there we go. Hashtag. Hashtag means it's a comment, meaning it's not actual code to execute. It's a comment. It's in there. It's just whatever you want to type in to help remind you of what's going on. All right, let's run that. And there we go, it prints out 12, like we expected to. But what if we have 5 plus 7 times 3? Well, let's make it easy math. 1 plus 2 times 3. So what is the answer to this? Is it 1 plus 2 is 3, then 3 times 3 is 9? It's not, right? Because we follow PEMDAS. So the first thing we do is anything in parentheses. Well, there's no parentheses. Then we do exponents. There's no exponents. Then we do multiplication. Oh, well, here's multiplication. So we do this first. 2 times 3 is 6. Okay. Then we do division. There's no division. Then we do addition. Okay. Well, this was 6. And this was 1. So 6 plus 1 is 7, right? And then subtraction, but we have no subtraction. Save it and run it. Sure enough, you get the answer 7. Now what we can do, we can use the parentheses to force that to happen first. So now when we run it and run through PEMDAS, first we do parentheses. So first it does the 1 plus 2 and gives us 3. And then 3 times 3 is 9, right? We'll see the difference here. Let's see it with and without parentheses. Copy and paste that. Put the parentheses on here. This will give us 7 because the multiplication happens first. This will give us 9 because the parentheses happen first. Save it and run it. There you go. The first is 7 and the second thing is 9. So when you're doing computations and calculations and things like that in Python, it's not just executing it left to right. You know, you have to pay attention to PEMDAS. And that's no different from, you know, your handwritten on a piece of paper math. I have a chat question. Is there a command to get certain amount of digits after a decimal? There is, I think what you're asking is, there is way to format your print statement so it prints out so many decimals. I'm not going to cover it right now. You can email me directly and I can answer that question to you. We do get to that later in the class, how you can format your print to where it shows a certain number of decimals. So yes, you can do that. It is later in the course, but if you want to know sooner than that, just get with me in an email offline. Okay, so that's PEMDAS, and that's math. That's variables. That's operators. So let's take a look at strings again. So say if I have a string, this is a string, right? Of course, I can print that out. And what's it going to print? It's going to print this is a string, right? There we go. This is a string. Well, you can use the addition sign on a string. Now I say that with a lot of caveats, right? You can't just add anything, right? So if I have A as this is a string and B equals this is another string, if I print just A, I print just B, I can have C is equal to A plus B. And then let's print C. So even though these aren't numbers, I can add strings together. And what do we think happens here? Well, what happens here when you add strings, it concatenates them together. What I mean by that is C will be this string immediately followed by this string. You're just putting them end to end, right? So if I run this, it should print out this is a string. Then it'll print out B, which is this is another string. Then it'll print out C, and C is those two things added together. If you look, sure enough, A is this is a string, B is this is another string, and C is both of those put together. This is a string, and then this is another string. There is no space in between them, and why is that? Because I didn't add in a space. You know, this string ended right at the G. This string started right at the T, and I didn't add a space in there. So you get exactly what you asked for. Now I could put a space in there, save it, and run it, and then we get the space in that added string. That's only because I put a space in there and I told it to add a space. So you can do additional strings. Can we do subtraction? The answer is no. And let's think about it for a second. You know, just logically, it makes sense to be able to add strings together. Does it? You know, just logically thinking of it, if you add two strings together, you can kind of figure out, you know, you put them together. But subtracting a string, you know, what does that mean? I don't think there's any logical reasoning that you could reach to figure out what subtracting a string would do. If you run it, sure enough, it tells you, it tells you exactly what the error is. Unsupported types for the subtraction. You're trying to subtract a string and a string, and you can't do that. You can try multiplying them. You can't do that. You can try dividing them, and you can't do that. And that makes sense because it just doesn't make sense to multiply strings together. So you can't do that, but you can add strings together. All right. we're almost, actually we are at the last topic, and then I'll talk about the assignment and then we'll go into questions. All right, so how do we get input from the user, right? So, we've been doing these little programs here, right? A is 5 plus 7, add it together, and the answer is 12. From a program standpoint, this is very useless, right? What good does this program do that just does this little calculation? Let's get input from the user. Let's ask them to put in some numbers, and then we'll add them together. Well, we'll take a step back from that. First, let's just get input from the user. We'll say A, and there's a Python built-in capability called input. And inside these parentheses, you tell it what you want the prompt to be. For my prompt, I'm going to use like the little sideways caret thing, right? And in a second, when I run it, you'll see what I'm talking about. And so then after we get the input, we'll just print it out. So what I'm saying is this variable A is equal to the input, and the prompt is going to be this little symbol. So whatever the user types in the keyboard, it's going to be stored in the variable A. Let's run that. So we run it. Right here, you can see that is my prompt. The little caret thing is my prompt. That's what I told it to be the prompt, was the little caret thing with a space in it. So now this is what I typed in at the keyboard. Type that in. I hit enter. And then what happens? It gets printed right back out to me. And that's because I said the variable A is equal to the input, and that means the input from the keyboard with that prompt, and then it's stored in the value A, and then I'm going to print that out. See it again. Let's make a different prompt. This is a different prompt. Hashtag. Save it and run it. There you go. There's my prompt. This is a different prompt. Hashtag. And then I type in ASDF, and then it prints it right back out to me. Okay. So let's think about this for a second. Earlier, we talked about types. We talked about integers, we talked about floats, and we talked about strings. So what type is A? So when I run it, and I type this in, I'm typing in at the prompt QWERTY, and then it prints out back out to me that variable A. But what is the type of A? Is it an integer? Is it a string? Or is it a float? Well, let's ask Python what the type of A is. So we're not going to print out A. We're going to print out what the type of A is. Let's save it and run it. And it says it's a string. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because I typed in QEWR. That's a string of letters, right? So it makes sense for that to be a string. And it doesn't matter which string of letters we type in. That variable is still a string. What happens if we type in a number? If I type in 1, 2, 3, what is going to be the type of A? It's still a string. So A is, even though I typed in a number, I typed in 1, 2, 3, it is still a string, meaning it is the string representation 1, 2, 3. It is not the integer number 1, 2, 3. That is a very important distinction that you need to understand. Is that even though at input I typed in an integer, I'll even change the prompt. Enter an int. I run it and I type in 222. That type of A is still a string because it is the string 222. It is not the number 222. Very important distinction to make. But you may say, well, what if I want to ask the user to input two numbers and add them together? Okay. So we'll input A, we'll make B is equal to another number. Then we'll say C is equal to A plus B. First, we'll print out what C is, and then we'll print out what the type of C is. Actually, let's print out the type of everything. So you can see this example as we go along. A, B, and C. All right. All right. So what are we doing here? We're getting input from the user and storing it in the variable A. We're getting input from the user and storing it in variable B. We're adding those two variables together and saving it in C. Then we're going to print out what C is. And then we're just going to print out all the types so we see what's going on behind the scenes. Let's save it. Let us run it. Enter an integer 1, 2, 3. Enter an integer 4, 5, 6. We added them together and we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's because, let me scroll up a little bit. There we go. That's because the type of A is a string. The type of B is a string. The type of C is a string. And just like I showed earlier, if you add two strings together, it just places them, concatenates them together. So what happens if we want to do the real math now? Here's where we need to turn it from a string into a number. We have in Python this concept called eval. Oops. We'll do it on the next line. So right here, print the type of A. We'll come back to the rest of this. So here we're getting the input, and then we're going to print out the type of A. But now let's convert that A into an actual number. And in Python, we have the thing called eval. Print type of A. So what's going to happen here now? Get the input from the user, store it in A, print out the type. Then we're going to say A is now equal to the eval of A. So if this was a string that represents a number, it's actually going to turn it into that number. Save it and run it. So if you run this and we type in 1, 2, 3, it was a string. Here it was a string, but here A is now an integer. Very useful, huh? And you can kind of chain this together by putting eval here around the input. So this will get the input, and the input is a string, but then we're going to say eval that string, which will turn it into an integer. Save it and let's run it. We type in a number. Sure enough, it's an integer. What happens if we type in a decimal number? It says it's a float, which is true. I typed in a float. What if I type in a string? It's an error because you can't eval a string. Gives you an error. So when you're doing this, before you use eval, you have to know that you're asking the user to input a number. If I would say here, enter your name and run this, if I'm the user and it says enter my name, I'm going to enter my name. But that's going to give me an error because I'm trying to eval the string Dan, and it can't convert that to a number. But if I tell the user to enter a number, save it and run it. Oh, I didn't save it. Save, there we go. Enter a number, 1, 2, 3, 4. There you go. It's now an integer. So if I want to add two numbers together, do this twice. I can tell the user enter a number and eval it, enter another number and eval it, add the two numbers together, and then we'll print out the result. Save it, run it, enter a number 5, enter a number 6. There you go, the answer is 11. Now we've done a mathematical computation based on what the user input. There's a chat message. I read that eval is unsafe to use. Why is that? And can we use float instead? Yeah, I'll say the course says, the course is teaching you to use eval. And it's really telling you to use eval because that's the simplest solution. And since this is basic course, they generally try to go with the simplest solution. But here is why eval is bad. Well, it's not necessarily bad. It depends on how you use it. So what eval does, it actually executes the code that is in here. So eval is bad if you're going to eval something that the user types in. Because I don't have a good example to show you to make up right off the top of my head. But if I say enter a number, all right, let's watch this. This is a little complicated. Let's print X. Just this right here. What's going to happen here? I'm trying to print X, but there is no such thing as X, right? Let's run it and enter a number. It's going to give me an error. It doesn't know what X is. But as the user of the program, I can make up an X. So even though it says enter a number here, I can actually write Python code here, and this program will execute it. I can say X is equal to 5. Well, that's still an error. I don't want to go too deep down this rabbit hole right now because it's beyond the scope of the class. But what the chat message means is if you know this is going to be a float, you can put float here and print A. So if we run this 3.14 and it does convert it to that float number. If you know it's going to be an integer, you can put int there and that'll turn it into an integer. Save it and run it 3.4 and it works. But you got to be careful here because what if you're expecting an integer, but the user types in a floating point number? Yeah, it crashes. There's an error. So eval helps in that situation a little bit better because it can take an integer or a floating point number. If you use either one in your assignments, I will accept either one. Generally, in professional level programming, the individual was right. You won't see eval in professional level programming. Okay. All right. So this is all the material that you were expected to go over and learn this week for the course. Let me take a look at the assignment real fast. See if there's anything that I want to mention about the assignment. Give me a second to bring it up. There's the assignment. All right, so your assignment is to compute what the wage is for this salesman, right? So you need to be able to ask the user for input. You need to have the user type in input at the keyboard. You need to do some kind of math operation on it, and then you need to display back what the result is. And that's actually kind of what we already did. We'll kind of go through that a little bit again. Keep in mind, I'm not going to give you the answer to the assignment here, but the concepts that I display here will directly relate to your assignment. So as I said, for the assignment, you need to get input from the user. You need to do some kind of math operation on it, and then you need to print out the result. So let's kind of do that. Let's get input from the user. We'll say enter. Let's do a math to compute miles per hour, right? for my example, we're going to compute miles per hour for a trip somebody took, right? So enter distance driven. And let's make the variable name make sense. Let's call it distance. You know, that's more descriptive than using a. Distance is more descriptive of what it actually is. So we'll enter the distance driven. And then we'll say hours is equal to, we're going to eval the input from the user, enter number of hours driven, right? And then let's just make sure it's doing what we think it is. Print out the distance and the hours. Let's run this. You see, we drove 100 miles in 2 hours. And sure enough, you know, it got in the right numbers. I'm printing out distance, then hours, and it prints out 100 and prints out 2. So I'm getting the input correctly, right? So if we want to compute miles per hour, that's simply, you know, distance divided by hours, right? And then let's make the print more useful. Your miles per hour was mph. So let's go over what this does. I have a variable called distance. I'm getting input from the user. I'm getting the input from the user. I'm converting it to a number with eval. Then for hours, I'm getting input from the user, then converting it to a number with the eval. Then I'm doing some math here. I'm saying this mile per hour variable is the distance divided by the hours. And then I'm going to print out your miles per hour was whatever the answer is. Let's save that. Let's run that. Distance was 100 miles over 2 hours, and your mile per hour was 50.0. And that's right. Right? We drove 100 miles over 3 hours. You know, this is the miles per hour. What if we did, let's, you know, check on learning here. What if we did 2 slashes? Now what's your mile per hour going to be? You know, if we remember, the double slashes means it's an integer division, meaning we drop off everything after the decimal place. So if we run this, the same numbers, mile per hour is 33 because we did the same division, but we dropped off all the decimal places. And this is about everything that you need for your assignment. Obviously, the input you're getting is different. The math computation that you were doing is different, but all the steps are represented right here as far as getting input, converting it to a number, doing some kind of math operation, and then printing out the result. And that's all there is to this first assignment. All right, so we'll get ready to open it up to questions, but first, just a reminder that your assignment is due by, what's it, Tuesday night, 11:59 p.m. Eastern time. Please make sure you get submitted before that. I do take late submissions. However, there is a point deduction for late submissions. Keep that in mind. And you can also work as far ahead as you want, but I will not grade something until the due date. And if you score poorly on an assignment, not a quiz and not the discussions, but if you score poorly on an assignment, you do have the option to resubmit it. So, you know, if you get a 50 on your first assignment, you can go back and correct your mistakes and turn it in again, and I will grade it again. The only caveat with that is if you resubmit it after the due date, then there is the late point penalty associated with that. But if you did poorly on the assignment, you can really improve your grade to fix your errors and resubmit it. All right. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and open it up for any questions you may have. And if you don't have any questions, that's fine. And you can feel free to drop off whenever you want. This is being recorded, and I will get it uploaded and a link sent out later this evening. All right, nothing heard so far. I'll stick around for about 2 more minutes before I close up shop here. All right, I'm going to go ahead. Oh, hold on a second. I do have a chat message. I just saw that popped up. So, sorry, I didn't see those at first. Can you give an example of finding a percentage like in the assignment? Sure. So all a percentage is a decimal place number, right? So if I say say I have a variable 3, I have a variable b, which is 10, right? So what percent is 3 of 10? Actually, let me make it more like the assignment. Let's say we have a is equal to the number 100, right? How do we calculate 2% of that number, right? So if we have a and we want 2%, is this it? If we print b, what's that answer? That gives us 200. 200 is certainly not 2% of 100, right? So it's a decimal number, meaning 0.02. This is 2%. Just like if we wanted 10%, it's this. 25% is this. Okay, so if we have a number, we have a variable 100, and we want to get 25% of that variable, then we just take the variable times the decimal representation of that percent. And this is not 0.25%. This is just 25%. So if we save it and run it, oops, we get the 25 because 25 is 25% of 100. If this was 50 and we wanted 25% of 50, then the answer to that is 12.5, and that's right. So that's how you get the percentage of a number. Okay, look at the other one. So when we use print equals, it can be int, string, float, but if we use input, we need to specify before what we want. Yeah, so for print will accept whatever you give it in here. Print can be an integer. Print can be a decimal. And print can be a string. And print is able to take all of those. There you go. Integer, decimal, or float, and a string. That's all fine. But yes, when you're getting input, A is equal to input, prompt. Input always gives you a string. This variable will always be a string. No matter what you type in, input gives you a string in return. That's why, if we want it to be an integer, we have to add integer on there around it. And what that does, it takes this string and converts it to an integer, or this string and converts it to a float. Does this make sense? Yeah, that doesn't really make sense, because input is already a string, and you're just saying convert this string into a string, but it's already a string, so you don't need the string there. You really just need the integer if it's an integer, the float if it's a float, or for this class you can use eval and it'll figure out for you if it's an integer or a float. Okay. A question, if we use a float and the user inputs an integer, it will still work, right? The answer to that is yes. It'll work in this direction. So if we then print A, so if we type in a float, 12.3, then that's fine. If we tell it a float, but we type in an integer, watch what happens. We typed in the integer, but it still gives us the decimal number, right? So that's what happens if you're telling it float, but you type in an integer, it just gives back to you the decimal representation of that integer. So that does work. But what breaks down is if you say float and you type in some text, that's where it breaks down. And for this class, I'm not for this basic course, I don't need you to try to check for those errors. So, if the user, if you say, I want a float and the user types in letters, that's not for this class, this basic class, that's not something you need to worry about. In the higher level courses, and certainly in professional programming, you need to take into account if the user types in something they're not supposed to. But for our class, I don't need you to worry about if the user is typing in invalid input. And what I mean by invalid input is if you're expecting a float and they type in letters, it's going to crash your program. But for this course, I don't need you to worry about that kind of invalid input.
Professor, I have a question.
Go ahead.
When it comes to writing out your code and all that, can we just copy and paste? Like if we have like similar, I don't know, things going on? Because I experienced that with the discussion where I was pretty much, I needed like the same information. I just changed a couple of things in there, but I started having like an error on the next line. So I decided to just rewrite every single thing, even though it was kind of like saying the same thing.
So, I mean, are you asking if you can like copy code from one part of your program to another part?
Yeah, and just change what I need to, or you know what I'm saying? Or is that just you have to rewrite everything every single time?
No, you can certainly copy and paste, and I've been doing that a lot while we've been doing this video. So, you know,
Okay.
take for example this line when you have A is equal to, you know, this stuff the user types in. I can certainly take that and put it a bunch of times.
Okay.
And then, you know, if I want to change it to B, C, D, E, F, you know, whatever the case is, all that will work perfectly fine. I can save it and run it. And so when I run this, it should ask me for the, you know, prompt, what, like 6 times? So, you know, there's the prompt. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then, you know, at the very end, I just, you know, set print whatever F was. So yeah, that certainly works to copy and paste. Something you have to be, maybe this was a problem you had, but Python is very particular about spacing and tabs at the beginning of your lines. So if you accidentally had a couple of spaces in there, pretty sure, yeah, that's gonna break. Because Python is very specific about spacing and tabs and anything at the beginning of your line of code. So if it was breaking and giving an error, that may have been why, is you got an extra space in there somehow.
Okay. Yeah, that answers my question.
Okay. All right, I'm going to have to go ahead and wrap this up. We're at the end of our time. I do have another one of these for another class here shortly. So I'm going to go ahead and shut it down, but I will get this put up on Facebook. Not Facebook. I will get it put up on YouTube, and I will put the link in the course announcements and send the link out in a little bit, so you can go back and review the video if you need to see anything we did earlier. So everyone have a good night, and remember your homework assignments and everything is due Tuesday night. All right, have a good night.